Welcome, everybody. My name is Adrienne Smith. I'm the president and CEO of the New Mexico Caregivers Coalition. So glad you could join us today. We're happy to have you. We're going to talk about some legislation here, and I'm going to just get us going here. You are in the right place. This is a virtual town hall for 2023 legislation. We're going to spend a little time this morning. We have an hour and a half set aside for our webinar, but we don't think it'll take that long. Nonetheless, we're doing a little bit of welcome and introductions. I'm going to talk a little about the organizational mission and current programs of the two organizations involved in this legislation. We're going to talk about a direct support professional workforce stabilization draft bill and a second option for setting a wage floor within future statewide rate studies. We'll end with a Q&A, and then we'll talk to you about next steps. And we are watching the Q&A. That's where you should put your questions. If you have them before we get to the Q&A section, you can do that at any time, but we'll probably take all the Q&A at the bottom at the end of this session. So I want to introduce my colleague, Pam Stafford of New Mexico Caregivers in Action. Pam.
Thank you for the introduction, Adrienne. Thank you to everyone for being here for what I hope will be an informative discussion. New Mexico Caregivers in Action is a statewide not-for-profit membership organization. The members within our organization are persons receiving services or care, unpaid or paid family caregivers, caregivers, direct support professionals, individuals, businesses, and organizations that want to support caregivers, direct care, and the organizational values of the New Mexico Caregivers in Action. We're set up with two different purposes. One is to offer benefits to those who need benefits, may be uninsured or lack benefits in their jobs. And so we offer access to discounted health, vision, dental, disability, legal, and life insurance. We also seek to elevate the voice of caregivers and care recipients in being heard in public policy and advocacy.
Thank you, Pam. Before I go into the introduction of New Mexico Caregivers Coalition, there are a lot of different kinds of people with us here today. And so we want to make room for that. And I'm going to ask Dana to put in, to launch a poll. We want to know who's here. There are two questions on this poll that we're going to ask you. There we go. Thank you. How do you identify, check all that apply? Meaning, are you with us today as a caregiver, an advocate, an agency, a state agency, a legislator or a funder? And you might wear lots of different hats. And then the second question, how many staff do you employ? That would be really great for us to know. We'll be sharing the results of these polls after today, or after this session rather. We'll probably send you a report out about what we learned from you as we delivered this information today. Great, some answers still coming in. Oh, great. We've got, I'll give you another minute. We've got probably about 3/4 of the folks have answered. I'll give you another minute before we end the poll. Thank you for playing with us. That's wonderful. So the Caregivers Coalition is an organization that was formed in, excuse me just a minute, in 2009. We started in 2009. We advocate for direct care workers' education, training, benefits, and wages, and their development. Part 2 of our organizational mission is so that they may better serve people who are elderly and those with disabilities. Developmental Disabilities Council provided seed funding to us to identify the voice of the caregiver. We held town halls like this, but we held them all in person in locations around the state. And the intentional decision of the first board of directors was that the caregiver is the organizational voice, if you will. We convene, this is what we think we do well. We convene stakeholders. Stakeholders are any number of people. We have a good representation of stakeholders in this webinar. They are caregivers, they're care recipients, they're employers or provider agencies. They're also elected officials. We know that there are better ways for caregivers to work. We know there are better options for them in the workplace. We spend a lot of time testing programs, testing pilots. We fail plenty of the time. We expand the things that work. We remain and want to remain a small staff because we can easily turn the ship or shift course when it comes time to do so. Our lens is that of workforce development. So just want to tell you about 2 programs that we have. This is training that we conduct for any agency and any set of caregivers at in a public setting. These are the examples of the trainings we provide. All the training that we provide at the caregiver level is tuition free because it's provided through grants that we receive. And Dana, I don't know if you're able to, but would you put that link down there into a way for participants to pick up that link if they're able to, just so you could take a look at some of those different trainings that we do. Everybody's welcome. The other thing that we do, and it's interesting because some providers have been telling us in this last year they wanted this to be a reality, and we made it a reality. We partnered with the Federal Reserve Bank to determine online, using a portal, how state and federal benefits for a caregiver could change if that caregiver gets a raise or goes on to higher education to get a promotion or even a different job. That portal was developed by the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. It's used by job seekers, HR directors, state policymakers, and it simulates the educational attainment and the career pathways. It simulates what happens to those public assistance benefits as a person moves up the ladder. The tool has New Mexico data, and it only has New Mexico data. We're really proud of that. And then the third thing that I wanted to tell you about, we've got also a piece of national significance, caregiver certification developed by ARCH National Respite Network for New Mexico using New Mexico data that delivers and then results in a certificate of completion, those skills that are required for becoming a respite care worker. Respite care worker in the developmental disabilities world or in the world for people who are elderly. It's a 7-hour course. It took me a little bit longer than 7 hours to finish. But we believe that it focuses heavily on care or service to persons with developmental disabilities. And our legislative principles, it's interesting that it's 2023. I remember we wrote these principles back in 2014. These things are real important to us, and this drives the work that we do when we do get involved in legislation. Our legislative principles are that legislation needs to recognize and advance caregivers of all sizes, shapes, colors, stripes. We seek to make publicly funded systems more transparent. At every opportunity, we prefer that legislation lifts up all caregivers, not just one segment of the care system or the care worker system. For that related reason, we seek to advance equity and equitable systems for caregivers, especially people of color. And lastly, we seek with all legislation to do no harm. certainly not to caregivers, but also not to care recipients or consumers. And I'll turn this back to Pam.
Thank you again for inviting me today, and to the people who are here today to hear our information. As I begin today, I want to take just a minute to honor Lois Curtis, who died last Thursday. She was the LC in the landmark civil rights Supreme Court decision that became to be known as the Olmstead decision. So I know many people know this history, but I'm going to go over it briefly. In 1981, home and community services were authorized as an alternative to institutionalization, but states were slow to embrace the service. The Olmstead decision in 1999 left states no choice but to offer alternatives to least restrictive options. In the 23 years since Olmstead, progress has been made, but home and community-based services have struggled with inadequate funding. Today, as New Mexico takes the historic option of removing all individuals with developmental disabilities off the wait list and into services, it is more important than ever that we think about a system change to both build capacity and sustain provider capacity. In the next few slides, I am going to make the argument that while there are many roles of support within the DD waiver system, that the intent of the Olmstead decision will never be fully realized until we put a higher value on the role of the direct support professional. The direct support professional responsibilities include, and this is just taken from a job description I pulled off a Google search, exhibiting compassion, supporting individuals in their homes or communities, and ensuring a safe environment. They are also expected to foster independence and personal choice by guiding individuals in acquiring necessary skills, such as social behavior or interpersonal competence, so individuals have greater self-reliance in their day-to-day lives. Next slide, please. So according to a recent town hall that was hosted by People First and the ARC New Mexico, the current shortage of direct support professionals is impacting services in such a way as to really mean that we're in violation of the Olmstead Act. It's impacting persons receiving services. People who have jobs are not able to go to jobs in the community. After a very restrictive COVID shutdown for many people with developmental disabilities, they're not able to resume typical community activities because they don't have the staff to help them, and they're not able to acquire the new skills that is mandated within the DD waiver system. This workforce shortage continues despite increased wages, which I have been provided with temporary American Rescue Plan Act funding. So one of the things we need to think about as a system is what happens when those funds are no longer available. And the Department of Health is taking this enormous and wonderful step of doing the super allocation, moving individuals from the DD waiver waitlist into services. But that's only further increases the need for direct support professionals. Next slide, please. Direct support professionals provide basic care to individuals in their homes and in the community. They are the people responsible on a daily, hourly, and moment-to-moment basis for the healthcare needs, safety, and ensuring safety in the homes and in the community. They're also responsible for implementing so many of the other plans that behavior therapists, nurses, speech language pathologists, nutritionists, occupational therapy, communication plans, physical therapy plans, all of those roles that are within our system are best implemented through having a well-trained and full complement of direct support professionals. Next slide, please. So to remember that direct support professionals help individuals learn budgeting, independent living skills, social and community skills. And that during the 2020 isolation, the only supports allowed in group homes were direct support professionals, not family members, not supervisors, not therapists. And so I would hope that we would, during this historic time, really value and recognize the importance of the direct support professionals. Next slide. Of course, it's not a New Mexico specific problem. It's a nationwide problem. And across the nation, public policy decisions are being made in order to increase recruitment and retention of qualified caregivers. This first bullet point here is from addressing wages of the direct care workforce through Medicaid policies, and it's put forth by the National Governors Associations. It's hot off the presses. It just came out last week. I'm hoping Dana would be able to put that link into either the chat or the Q&A, so people would be able to access that as well. And here's a direct quote from them in terms of simply raising minimum wages as a way to recruit and retain staff. The state minimum wage offers no competitive advantage for direct care workers' recruitment and retention because wages are the same for those working in retail and hospitalities. Workers are more likely to seek jobs with fewer training certification requirements and that are less demanding. I just went over the list of things that direct support professionals have to do. It's a hard physical job. It's a hard mental job. It's a hard emotional job. It can be very rewarding, but it's a difficult, challenging job that should be higher than minimum wage. So 24 states have pursued policy changes directed to improving caregiver wages. 24 states. So it's really not a novel thing. It's a thing that many states are doing. And on the bottom bullet, you have a list of those states that have increased provider reimbursement rates with the requirement that a percentage be passed on to direct support professionals. They include our neighbor, Colorado, Connecticut, Florida, Indiana, Louisiana, New York, Oregon, Rhode Island, and Tennessee. Naturally, with the crisis in workforce, in the workforce that exists today, with the information that we're hearing from self-advocates and caregivers and family members about how this crisis is impacting them, and with the super allocation, the New Mexico Caregivers in Action and New Mexico Caregivers Coalition are interested in taking some steps to bring New Mexico in line with the 24 other states that have enacted these policy changes. And I'm moving it back over to Adrienne to discuss what those are.
Thank you, Pam. So we started with this first draft. We have it now. It's called Direct Support Professional Workforce Stabilization Bill. It does a couple of things, but it's pretty simple. Once you break it down, there are essentially two components of the bill: data collection and setting a minimum wage floor for caregivers. So the bill requires New Mexico Department of Health, DDSD, Developmental Disability Supports Division, to collect workforce data annually. All kinds of metrics on people in the workforce within that provider agency related to workforce volume, stability, and then their compensation. The bill requires DDSD to report that data publicly, including legislators, resulting in greater transparency within the system. And then, as I said, the bill sets a wage floor for caregivers, specifically this type of caregiver, direct support professionals or DSPs, of 150% of the highest federal, state, county, or minimum wage. Federal, state, or county minimum wage. And then lastly, the bill requests new funding of $8.4 million. Pam, I'll let you talk about this second option that we have that we're speaking about internally now.
Yes. So part of having being a good legislative advocate is trying to build a strong coalition to give your legislation the best possibility of passing. There was a presentation in October before the Legislative Health and Human Services Committee that Adrian and I participated in, and so did members of ADCAP, who had a separate bill that simply requested the funding without the other components of the bill. What we are hearing and want to acknowledge is that the primary opposition to the bill that Adrian just described is the minimum floor wage, the 150% of minimum wage for caregivers. There's opposition to that. And so we've been trying to think about how to compromise in a way that would remove that, but without sacrificing the valuation of direct support professionals at 150%. And so our thoughts are that we could replace the requirement of provider paid wage floor to caregivers, and instead try to build 150% of the wage floor into the required rate studies, which the bill already would increase to being every 2 years. And why do we want the bill to increase rate studies every 2 years? When you do rate studies every 5 years, which is the current requirement, then what you end up doing is going to the legislature this year again to say, can we fund the rates from 5 years ago? And the economy just changes too fast. So every 2 years would help to keep the rates current. Then within those rates, if we say we have to begin with direct support professionals being valued at 150% of the minimum wage, then everything else is built on top of that, but that begins with that valuation. We maintain the workforce data collection, the reporting, and the transparency, but because we are not mandating a wage increase, there would be no requirement for additional funding within this bill, which would also make it an easier bill to pass. So what we want to do now is do a comparison of the bill, that's the draft, and then the second option that we've been discussing on an internal basis. So if you look at this document, the first column is what the bill is a question. Would the bill do this? And then the second and third column, the second is the bill that's already been drafted, and the third is the option that we've been talking about internally. So valuing DSP's positions in statute at 150% of minimum wage, both bills do that. Require statewide rate studies every 2 years, both bills do that. Require DOH, DDSD collect workforce data, yes, both bills do that. Mandate that rate studies include salaries for DSPs at 150% of highest fed, state, or county minimum wage. Yes, the bill would do that because if there's a mandate to pay that wage, rate studies have to take that into consideration. The other option would do that simply by mandating that all rate studies consider that the wage for direct support staff. Would it mandate DOH, DDSD to report to the legislature the full amount required to fund the studies? Yes, both bills would do that. Would it mandate providers pay higher wages even if the cost is not funded by the legislature? Neither bill does that. Within the first bill, there is a kind of a parachute clause that says that in any year that the legislature does not fund the increase, that providers do not have to pay the higher wage. And there's no mandate of wages within the second option. Would it include a reoccurring state appropriation and also federal match of those state funds? The bill we suggested would. But the option, the second option would not. Would it include would it mandate that DSPs are paid at least 100% of highest fed state or county minimum wage? The bill would. The option we were discussing would not. Would it include independent contractors in the bill? In the current bill, it does not include that. In the option, independent contractors are included in the calculations of rate studies. The next thing we want to move into is kind of some more complicated issues related to the bill and the option and how those are similar and different. And Adrian and I are going to split the discussion of these.
Thank you, Pam. So one of the issues that we've heard since we've been working on this bill, which has been a year and a half, by the way, the question is, would the bill and the option result in higher reimbursement rates to providers, developmental disabilities waivers providers? The summary answer, higher reimbursement rates for providers are always dependent on funding by the legislature and the executive branch, as well as approval by CMS, Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services. Yet both seek higher reimbursement rates in that they place a greater valuation on the direct support professional. The differences in the two are that the bill includes an appropriation for provider reimbursement rate increases, 8.4 million. The option does not include an appropriation. There are no monies needed for implementing the option. The similarity is either one, if passed and signed by the governor, will impact, we believe, future statewide rate studies. And you're on next.
So the other issue that we've heard and that we very specifically wanted to address is, would the bill and option result in higher wages for direct support professionals? And the summary answer is that the value of the direct support professional at 150% of the highest of fed state or county minimum wage are in both bills. Both recognize that the DSPs are essential. The difference is that the bill, as it's currently written, would result in a higher wage for direct support professionals. It would mandate that. The option would not mandate a wage floor, so it does not guarantee higher wages for direct support professionals. How they're similar is that both will collect workforce data, volume, stability, and compensation. And the data may, in turn, result in higher wages for direct support professionals over time.
Thank you, Pam. The third issue we've heard, will the bills address the current vacancy rates of direct support professionals? That is a key problem that we're seeking to address right now. Both solutions are designed to address the current and ongoing vacancy rates of DSPs by valuing DSPs at a wage significantly higher than minimum wage. The differences are that the bill seeks to address the vacancy rate by appropriating new money into the system and then making sure that those funds are passed on directly to direct support professionals. The option that we're considering does not include an appropriation, so it's unclear what impact beyond the data collection the option would have directly on wages. And finally, in terms of the similarity of the bill and the option, both of these maintain that the direct support professionals shall be valued for their work at higher than minimum wage. Both establish a position that future statewide rate studies set the DSP value at a 150% of the highest of federal, state, or county minimum wage. And then there's a fourth and final issue here. Pam?
And so that fourth issue is, how do these bills improve or provide for providers flexibility to use funds in other areas of their business, which is something we've clearly heard providers say that they need. So neither bill, no option, denies providers flexibility to spend money in other areas. The difference is that the bill mandates that 150% of highest minimum wage be paid to DSPs, but beyond that requirement, any and all remaining funds may be used in any way by providers. The option we're looking at provides the flexibility that providers say they need, but it does not mandate increases in DSP wages. Both options values the system as a whole and include cost of living adjustments, inflation, and consideration of wages of other workers. Both states that rate studies shall be conducted every 2 years, with the starting point of the direct support professionals being 150% of the highest minimum wage. And as we go back to the slides, then I just wanted to kind of wrap up one further thing about the option that we're talking about internally, which is that one of the oppositions that I've heard to this option is the fact that if we value direct support professionals at 150% of minimum wage, that's included in the rate study. The rate study mandates or doesn't mandate, but it suggests, recommends higher rates. And the legislative and executive branch agrees to that and fully funds this, that there is no requirement of providers to increase wages. And so how would fully funding the system then result in better wages for staff and for better care for direct support providers? And I really want to argue that that you have to include the data collection piece as a way to see that option as a whole. That if the system is fully funded, providers have a responsibility to provide services. They have a contractual obligation to provide services in a quality way and to reduce the vacancy rates of direct support staff. They cannot provide services without an adequate workforce. So the data will reflect how the higher rates are impacting the vacancy rates. And the market can then influence the wages. If I'm a consumer, I am able to make a better informed choice if I know that one service, one provider has a higher and significant vacancy rate than another provider, and I don't feel like I'm getting adequate services, I now have some data to help me make some informed decisions. But there is no mandate there would be no mandate for the higher wages, and providers would maintain the flexibility to be able to put the higher rates where they would want it, or where their business model suggests it should go. And with that, I will move it back to Adrian. Thank you again.
Thank you, Pam. So this is just a little chart that shows you at the U.S. Department of Labor level what is happening as we speak. It's not only a crisis, as Pam noted a few slides ago, in New Mexico. This is a nationwide crisis. But these jobs of the caregiver will have more job openings than any other occupation in New Mexico. We've already been the fastest growing occupation in New Mexico for the last 10 years, and it will continue to be so. But we've already had a problem filling these jobs because of the low quality of their jobs. But look at how many we will need in New Mexico by the year 2028. We have several questions that have come up in the Q&A, and we will go to those in just a minute. But at this moment, just kind of your take on this, because we very much want this to be interactive with you to the degree that we can do that with this many people. So I'd like to ask Dana Howarth if you will share this next poll with folks, launch that next poll where we ask you what parts of what you've heard so far are the most important to you. What would you like to see happen? And we just broke it down in these 4 things. I realize there are maybe other questions that you still have, but in terms of these 4 things, what are the most important to you? And this poll will let you choose more than one thing. You can choose all, you can choose none, you can choose 1 or 2. Great, lots of answers coming in. We wanted to use this as an opportunity to really kind of distinguish for you too the difference between actual payments to DSP caregivers versus putting that in the rate study. We wanted to use this as that opportunity too. And we still have lots of answers coming in. I'll give you about 30 more seconds before we move to questions. That's great. Thank you very much for sharing that with us, your thoughts with us. Okay. So I'm moving here to questions. We've got several. Put your questions in the Q&A if you like. I'm going to take these in order that we receive them. I'm going to answer this question about the data to determine the 8.4 million and where that came from a little bit later, but I do have a slide for that I do want to share with you. Are you taking into account inflationary items like rent, utilities, groceries, etc.? Yes, the answer is yes. In our bill, the Direct Support Professional Workforce Stabilization Bill, cost of living adjustments and inflation and compression, wage compression, to answer a later question that also came up, all of those are written into the legislation. That those issues need to be considered under the bill. And here's that other question: did wage compression does this bill take into account wage compression? And yes, it does. That was one of the first issues that we heard, and we have attempted to account for that in our legislation. Will these slides be shared with us? Yes, indeed, they will. After today. What do your data say about average hourly rate for a DSP in New Mexico? Today, we know from a provider study that Jason Cornwell of DDSD just administered that it's about $14.43. Immediately prior to that, and inflation and post-COVID numbers was more like $11.14. So these the wages of these jobs simply aren't keeping up. And we feel like that's why we needed this solution, and several other states do too. How did you determine 150% of the minimum wage was the right number? That's a great question. We actually are hoping, to have some discussion about this. We thought that it just needed to be some amount higher than minimum wage. But we've been open to a discussion about that 150%. Thank you for the question. My agency spends 70% of our revenue on DSP wages and benefits. That's fantastic. That's just wonderful. Let me share with you, please, a spreadsheet of where that 8.4 million came from. We work with PHI. PHI is a national organization. I like to call it a best in field organization, the national level, that advocates for direct care workers of all sizes, shapes, and colors. And we took 2021 data from the state of New Mexico Department of Health, DDSD, worked with the analysts in that division, DDSD, took all of the 2021 figures. This is why considering inflation and compression was all important. And we came up with this. I'm not sure that you can see this, and I'd be happy to send this to you because this is public information. Here's 8,314,634. We just rounded up. This number includes inflation, cost of living adjustment, and we tried to consider compression. There are lots of tabs behind this number, but this is the number to answer your question where that came from. So I'm happy to send that out. We'll send out the slides.
If I could add to that, Adrian, the fact that this would be matched money, federally matched funds as well.
Good. So let's hear from you again. What else would you like to know? What are you interested in supporting? And what strategies would you like to either be part of or share with us about how to do things? So Dana, if you would, could you administer this third and final poll? Dana's going to ask how you want to be involved, and we will also check in the Q&A while you're answering this third and final poll. Numbers still coming in. Thank you for your answers. Another question came in the Q&A as you're finishing up your poll. Jerry Ortiz-Pino and Senator Jerry Ortiz-Pino and Representative Liz Thompson will be sponsoring the bill. We're still hopeful that we might be able to get the full LHHS endorsement, depending on how well a meeting goes next week. And then another question that came in, have you polled different providers to see who's in support of this bill? And thank you for that question. This is our first attempt to do that. The very reason we held this town hall was so that we could hear from you in the polls, in the Q&A, see how you want to be involved, whether you want to be involved in all of this. We're just trying to get out as much information as we, possibly can. And Pam, there's another question. Could you answer this? I'm not sure what that means about the QA question. You're on mute. Pushback from DDSD.
Yes, so our feedback from DDSD is that they would not need an allocation or any additional funds into their system in order to be able to collect the workforce data. So no, we asked that question very specifically and was told no, that was not a need.
And that a related question, did the Department of Health DDSD support the Direct Support Stabilization Act? I think they have to remain agnostic in what they say publicly. I wouldn't attempt to answer anything for them, but I'll tell you that it's been a pleasure to work with them. And we got here by listening to them and those issues. I think we've answered what, just one more second. Numbers feasible. That's a good question. If two different organizations, this coalition and a trade organization have different pieces of legislation, what happens if both bills move forward? I would say we would encourage everybody on this webinar to get involved with the one that you would like to push forward.
And if I could add, it's also possible for two bills to move forward without and to have both be supported. It's not necessarily an either or.
Mm-hmm. Another question, this policy benefit only people who are receiving services through the DD waiver. The bill we've talked about today, Tommy, does just that. We have a companion bill, the personal care services bill, that's a parallel bill that would do essentially the same for people on the personal care services side of the Medicaid funded program. Thank you, Marilyn from Idaho.
And if I could answer did you take into consideration the amount of overtime providers are currently paying out due to short staff? We believe that increasing retention and recruitment and reducing vacancy rates would reduce that overtime.
Good. Well, I hope you will get involved. I hope you will contact us if you have any other questions. We will certainly get the slides out to you and the page of the Excel calculation. And I thank you very much for being here.